I mostly read public domain books here on Glenn Reads Books to You, and they were written a long time ago, so they're usually racist, or sexist, or bigoted, but in there somewhere is a story, and that's why those stories are famous. Other times, I read works from independent authors, and they're delightfully not racist, but they might have adult language or adult situations, like, making sex. So that's your warning, but I'm sure you're grown up enough to handle it. Don't write to me complaining. Sunday night. A time for me, where I hear the footsteps. God damn it, I forgot to lock the door. Listen to your tiny little footsteps like some kind of idiot just running up here. Who gets this excited to have someone read books to you? This is disturbing. Welcome to the Glenn Reads Books to You mansion. It's a fun little bit where I pretend to live in a mansion and not just recording in my basement. This is where I read the hottest public domain books and short stories. This week, we're going to continue to read and finish reading The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald, a book that a friend of mine, Backy Wop, asked that I read about, 2 years ago, and I never got around. You okay over there?
Sorry.
Are you doing something that's almost legal in this state, but not legal yet? Don't make that face. You can find him at versimilitudino.us, which I will link in the show notes. You want to hear about the author? Sure. Francis Scott Key Fitzgerald was an American novelist, essayist, and short story writer, always best known for his novels depicting the flamboyance and excess of the Jazz Age, a term he popularized in his short story collection, Tales of the Jazz Age. And during his lifetime, he published 4 novels, 4 story collections, 164 short stories. Although he achieved temporary popular success and fortune in the 1920s, Fitzgerald received critical acclaim only after his death and is now widely regarded as one of the greatest American writers of the 20th century, which he stole all his stuff from his wife. Want to hear a fun fact? Fitzgerald wrote a play that bombed. In the early 1920s, Fitzgerald worked on The Vegetable, a play that lampooned America's get-ahead mania. The quote-unquote vegetable in question, Jerry Frost, pines to be a postman. Burp. He gets tight one night and dreams that he is president. In fact, no one more wants to be president than he wants to be a poodle. What? And he thinks that he should want to be president in a culture obsessed with power, money, and mobility. Fitzgerald's skeptical look on the American dream in this play did not endear him to audiences. The play opened in Atlantic City's Apollo Theater in November 1923 and died in a single dispiriting performance. Isn't that fun? Well, this is going to be quite the episode. I found out that Nick, the main character, is probably gay or something. And so I'm going to talk all about that at the end, and I'm going to have to do a big, long sum up of what I think of this book at the end. So enjoy the story as we go to the library and sit and I read to you. And then you can probably just, turn the show off whenever you get bored. I'll see you in the library. Well, there you are. You finally made your way over here to the library. Why don't we finish this book since it's the last chapter? Let's get wet. Chapter 9. After 2 years, I remember the rest of that day, and that night and the next day, only as an endless drill of police and photographers and newspaper men in and out of Gatsby's front door. A rope stretched across the main gate, and a policeman by it kept out the curious, but little boys soon discovered that they could enter through my yard, and were always a few of them clustered open-mouthed about the pool. Someone with a positive manner, perhaps a detective, used the expression, quote, madman, unquote, as he bent over Wilson's body that afternoon, and the adventurous authority of his voice set the key for the newspaper reports that next morning. Most of those reports were a nightmare. Oh, grotesque. circumstantial, eager, and untrue. When McCallus' testimony at his inquest brought to light Wilson's suspicions of his wife, I thought the whole tale would shortly be served up in racy pasquinade. Let's look up pasquinade. That's got to be exciting to learn about. I actually said it right, pasquinade. A satire or lampoon, originally one displayed or delivered publicly in a public service. No, sucks to that. That was horrible. But Catherine, who might have said anything, didn't say a word. She showed a surprising amount of character about it, too. She looked at the corridor with determined eyes under that corrected brow of hers, and she swore that her sister had never seen Gatsby, and that her sister was completely happy with her husband, and that her sister had been into no mischief whatsoever. She convinced herself of it and cried into her handkerchief as if the very suggestion was more than she could endure. So Wilson was reduced to a man deranged by grief in order that the case might remain in its simplest form. And it rested there. But all this part of it seemed remote and inessential. And I found myself on Gatsby's side and alone. From the moment I telephoned news of the catastrophe to the West Egg Village, every surmise about him and every practical question was referred to me. At first, I was surprised and confused. And then as he lay in his house and didn't move or breathe or speak, hour upon hour, it grew upon me that I was responsible because no one else was interested. Interested, with that intense personal interest to which everyone has some vague right in it. I called up Daisy half an hour after we found him, called her instinctively and without hesitation, but she and Tom had gone away early that afternoon and taken baggage with them. Left no address? No. Say when they'd be back? No. Any idea where they are? How I could reach them? I don't know. Can't say. I wanted to get someone for him. I wanted to go into the room where he lay and reassure him. I'll get somebody for you, Gatsby. Don't worry. Just trust me, and I'll get someone for you. Meyer Wolfsham's name wasn't in the phone book. The butler gave me his office address on Broadway, and I called information, but by the time I had the number, it was long after 5, and no one answered the phone. Will you ring again? I've rung him 3 times. It's very important. My wife is crawling up the basement stairs. Why are you now suddenly worried about making noise on the podcast?
I'm always worried about that.
You have a stance of a cat.
I'm trying to be as quiet as possible.
You're doing a great job. Yeah, no, keep going as quiet as possible. That's right. That's my baby. I married you for a reason. And now it's become evident. I've rung him 3 times. It's very important. Sorry, I'm afraid there's no one there. Well, I went back to the drawing room and thought for an instant that they were chance visitors. All these official people who suddenly filled it. But as they drew back the sheet and looked at Gatsby with unmoved eyes, his protest continued in my brain. Look here, old sport. You've got to get someone for me. You got to try hard. And I can't go through this alone. You're back. Just slowly closing that door. Slowly walking down the stairs. I do like seeing your getaway sticks emerge themselves procedurally over time as you go down the stairs. Those shapely little gams. I'm trying to read a book. You gotta try hard. I can't go through this alone. Someone started to ask me questions, but I broke away and going upstairs looked hastily through the unlocked parts of his desk. He'd never told me definitely that his parents were dead, but there was nothing. Only the picture of Dan Cody, a token of forgotten violence, staring down from the wall. Next morning, I sent the butler to New York with a letter to Wolfsheim, which he asked for information and urged him to come out in the next train. That request seemed superfluous. And then when I wrote it, but I was sure that he'd start when I saw the newspapers, just as I was sure that there'd be a wire from Daisy before noon. But neither a wire nor Wolfsheim arrived. No one arrived, except more police. and photographers and newspapermen. And when the butler brought back Wolfsheim's answer, I began to have a feeling of defiance. Of scornful solidarity between Gatsby and me and against them all. By the way, this is Gatsby that he just recently said, I don't like him. I never give him a compliment. I gave him one compliment just to make him feel good. But by the way, when he dies, he is 100% on that guy's side. Is it from guilt? Or is it because he's always been obsessed with this guy and he can't be honest with himself? Dear Mr. Carraway, this has been one of the most terrible shocks of my life to me, and I hardly can believe it is all true. Such a mad act as that man did should make us all think. I cannot come down now as I'm tied up in some very important business and cannot get mixed up in this thing now. If there's anything I could do a little later, let me know in a letter by Edgar. I hardly know where I am when I hear about a thing like this, and I am completely knocked down and out. Yours truly, Meyer Wolfsheim. And then hastily, addenda beneath, let me know about the funeral, etc. Do not know his family at all. When the phone rang that afternoon, the long distance and the Chicago was calling, and I thought that this would be Daisy at last. But a connection came through as a man's voice, very thin and far away. This is Slaggle speaking. Yes. The name was unfamiliar. Hell of a note, isn't it? Get my wire? There haven't been any wires. Young Park's in trouble, he said rapidly. They picked him up, and he handed the bonds over the counter, and they got a circular from New York, giving him numbers just 5 minutes before. What do you know about that, hey? You never can tell in these hick towns. Hello, I interrupted breathlessly. Look here, this isn't Mr. Gatsby. Mr. Gatsby's dead. There was a long silence on the other end of the wire, followed by an exclamation, and then a quick squawk as the connection was broken. I think it was on the third day that a telegram signed Henry C. Gatz arrived from a town in Minnesota. What? It said that only the sender was leaving immediately and to postpone the funeral until it came. It was Gatsby's father, a solemn old man, very helpless and dismayed, bundled up in a long, cheap ulster against the warm September day. His eyes leaked continuously with excitement, and when I took the bag and umbrella from his hands, he began to pull so incessantly at his sparse gray beard that I had difficulty getting off his coat. He was on the point of collapse, and so I took him to the music room and made him sit down while I sent for something to eat. But he wouldn't eat. And the glass of milk spilled from his trembling hand. I saw it in the Chicago newspaper, he said. It was all in the Chicago newspaper. I started right away. I don't know how to reach you. His eyes, seeing nothing, moved ceaselessly about the room. It was a madman, he said. It must have been mad. Wouldn't you like some coffee? I urged him. I don't want anything. I'm all right now, mister. Carraway. Well, I'm all right now. Where have they got Jimmy? And I took him into the drawing room, where his son lay, and left him there. Some little boys had come up on the steps and were looking into the hall, and when I told them who had arrived, they went reluctantly away. And after a little while, Mr. Gatz opened up the door and came out, and his mouth ajar, and his face flushed slightly, and his eyes leaking isolated and unpunctual tears. He had reached an age where death no longer has the quality of ghastly surprise. And when he looked around him now for the first time, he saw the height and splendor of the hall, and the great rooms opening out from it on the other rooms. Oh, his grief began to get mixed with awed pride. I helped him into a bedroom upstairs while he took off his coat and his vest, and I told him all the arrangements had been deferred until he came. I don't know what you'd want, Mr. Gatsby. Gatz is my name. Mr. Gatz, I thought you might want to take the body west. He shook his head. Jimmy always liked it better down east. He rose up in a position of these. Were you a friend of my boys, Mr.? We were close friends. He had a big future before him, you know. He was only a young man, but he had a lot of brain power there. He touched his head impressively, and I nodded. If I had lived, he'd been a great man. A man like James J. Hill. Oh, he'd helped build up the country. That's true, I said uncomfortably, and he fumbled at the embroidered coverlet, trying to take it from the bed, and lay down swiftly. He was instantly asleep, and that night an obviously frightened person called up and demanded to know who I was before he would give his name. This is Mr. Carraway, I said. Oh, he sounded relieved. This is Klipspringer. And I was relieved, too, for that seemed to promise another friend at Gatsby's grave. I didn't want it to be in the papers and draw a sighting crowd, so I'd been calling up a few people myself, and they were hard to find. The funeral's tomorrow, I said, at 3 o'clock, and here at the house, and I wish you'd tell anybody who's interested. Oh, I will, he broke out hastily. Of course, I'm not likely to see anybody, but if I do... His tone made me suspicious. Of course, you'll be there yourself. Well, I'll certainly try. What I called up about is... Wait a minute, I interrupted. How about saying you'll come? Well, the fact is, the truth of the matter is, I'm staying with some people up here in Greenwich, and they'd rather expect me to be with them tomorrow. In fact, there's a sort of picnic or something, and of course I'll do my very best to get away. I ejaculated in unrestrained, "Ha!" And then he must have heard me, for he went on nursing. What I called up about was a pair of shoes I left there. And I wonder if it'd be too much trouble to have your butler send them on. You see, they're tennis shoes, and I'm sort of helpless without them. And my address here is in care of BF, and I didn't hear the rest of the name because I hung up the receiver. And after that, I felt a certain shame for Gatsby. One gentleman to whom I telephoned implied that he had got what he deserved. However, that was my fault, for he was one of those that had a sneer most bitterly at Gatsby on the courage of Gatsby's liquor, and I should have known better than to call him. The morning of the funeral, I went up to New York to see Meyer Wolfsheim and couldn't seem to reach him any other way. The door that I pushed open on the advice of an elevator boy was marked the Swastika Holding Company. Ugh. And at first there didn't seem to be anyone inside. But when I'd shouted, hello, several times in vain, an argument broke out behind a partition, and presently a lovely Jewess appeared at the interior door. This is already going to be problematic, and scrutinized me with black, hostile eyes. No, nobody's in, she said. Mr. Wolfsheim's gone to Chicago. The first part of this was obviously untrue, for someone had begun to whistle The Rosary tunelessly inside. Please say that Mr. Carraway wants to see him. I can't get him back from Chicago, can I? And at this moment a voice, unmistakably Wolfsheim's, called Stella from the other side of the door. Leave your name on the desk, she said quickly, and I'll give it to him when he gets back. But I know he's there. She took a step toward me and began to slide her hands indignantly up and down her hips. What the hell? Young men think you can force your way in here at any time, she scolded. We're getting sick and tired of it. And when I say he's in Chicago, he's in Chicago. Now, I mentioned Gatsby. Oh, She looked at me over again. Will you just, what's your name? And she vanished. A moment later, Meyer Wolfsheim stood solemnly in the doorway, holding out both hands. He drew me into his office, remarking in a reverent voice that it was a sad time for us all, and offered me a cigar. Oh, my memory goes back to when I first met him, he said. A young major just out of the army and covered over with medals he got in the war. Oh, he was so hard up, he had to keep on wearing the uniform because he couldn't buy some regular clothes. First time I saw him was when he had come into Weinberger's pool room at 42nd Street and then asked for a job. And he hadn't had anything for a couple of days. Come and have some lunch with me, I said. He ate more than $4 worth of food in half an hour. Did you start him in business? I inquired. Start him? I made him. Oh, I raised him up out of nothing, right out of the gutter. I saw right away that he was a fine appearing, gentlemanly young man, and when he told me that he was at Oxford, I knew that I could use him good. I got him to join up the American Legion, and he used to stand high there. Right off did some work for a client of mine up in Albany, and we were so thick that it was like it had everything. He held up two bulbous fingers, always together. I wondered if this partnership had included the World Series transaction of 1919. Now he's dead, I said after a moment. You were his closest friend, so I know you'll want to come to his funeral this afternoon. Oh, I'd like to come. Well, then come then. His hair and his nostrils quivered slightly as he shook his head, and his eyes filled with tears. I can't do it. I can't get mixed up in it, he said. There's nothing to get mixed up in. It's all over now. When a man gets killed, I never like to get mixed up in it in any way. I keep out. When I was a young man, it was different. If a friend of mine died, No matter how, I stuck with him to the end. But you may think that's sentimental, but I mean it, to the bitter end. And I saw, for some reason of his own, he was determined not to come, so I stood up. "Are you a college man?" he inquired suddenly. For a moment I thought he was going to suggest gonna gettin'. I hate this. But he only nodded and shook my hand. "Let us learn how to show our friendship for a man when he's alive and not after he's dead," he suggested. "And after that, my own rule is to let everything alone." When I left his office, the sky had turned dark, and I had got back to West Egg in a drizzle, and after changing my clothes, I went next door and found Mr. Gatz walking up and down excitedly in the hall. And when his pride in his son and his son's possessions was continually increasing, and now he had something to show me. "Jimmy sent me this picture." He took out his wallet with trembling fingers. "Look there." Well, with that, I feel mildly aroused. "Would you perhaps want to come up to my master bedroom where everything's made of silk? The walls are made of silk. The ceiling has got a big piece of silk on it, of course with a mirror. And then the floors are shag, but it's not shag like you think of shag. It's shag made of giant fibers of silk. Silk shag. Everything's silk, including the bed sheets. Come up there and let me read to you the latest in romance literature from Penguin Random House Books." "Oh, there you are. And you look magnificent, wearing that large floral muumuu with a giant sun hat. Oh, you're singing lightly like an angel, and you're holding a little book. If you hand it to me, I'd like to see what you're reading. A book's called Practice Makes Perfect by Sarah Adams. You want to hear more about Practice Makes Perfect? Sure. It's a small-town sweetheart and emotionally unavailable bad boy try to find common ground in this chemistry-filled romance from the authors of Cheat Sheet and When in Rome. Annie Walker is on a quest to find her perfect match, someone who complements her happy, quiet life running the local flower shop in Rome, Kentucky. But finding her dream man may be harder than Annie imagined. Everyone knows everyone in her hometown, and the dating prospects are getting fewer by the day. After she overhears her latest date say that she is so unbelievably boring, Annie starts to think that the problem might be her, and it might be too late to become flirtatious and fun like the leading ladies in her favorite romance movies, ? Maybe she only needs a little practice, ... and Annie has the perfect person in mind to be her tutor, Will Griffin. Will, the sexy, tattooed, and absolutely gorgeous bodyguard is temporarily back in Rome, providing security for Amelia Rose as excitement builds for her upcoming marriage to Noah Walker. Annie's brother. And she has one personal objective while she's on the job. Stay away from Annie Walker and any other possible attachments to this sleepy town. But no sooner than she gets settled, Will finds himself tasked with helping Annie find the love of her life by becoming the next leading lady of Rome, Kentucky. Will wants no part of changing the sweet and lovely Annie. Oh, he knows, in fact, that some stuffy, straight-laced guy won't make her happy, but she doesn't have the heart to say no. Amid steamy practice, dates, the strictly educational tutoring lessons, Annie discovers that there are more layers to Will's usual stoic attitude, as well as the lines of their friendship become dangerously blurred. Annie reconsiders her dream guy. Maybe the love of her life doesn't need to be perfect, Maybe it just needs to be real. Yeah, that's Practice Makes Perfect by Sarah Adams. It's coming out in paperback at $17 May 2nd, available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, Bookshop.org, Hudson Booksellers, Powell's, Target, and Walmart. Well, that was stupid, and I'm not aroused anymore. So why don't you take your little moo-moo and your sun hat and go back downstairs to the library so I can finish reading the rest of this story to you. Well, there you are. Now you're back. Why don't we dive into the rest of this story? It was a photograph of the house, cracked in the corners and dirty with many hands. He pointed out every detail to me eagerly. Look there! And then he saw admiration in my eyes. And he had shown it so often that I think it was more real to him now than he thought himself. Jimmy sent it to me. I think it's a very pretty picture, and it shows up well. Very well. Have you seen him lately? He came out to see me 2 years ago and bought me the house I live in now. Of course, we was broke up when he had run off from home, but now I see there was a reason for it. He knew he had a big future in front of him, and ever since he made a success, he was very generous with me. He seemed reluctant to put away the picture, and he held it for another minute, lingeringly before my eyes. And then he returned the wallet and pulled from his pocket a raggedy old copy of a book called Hop Along, Cassidy. Look here, this is a book he had when he was a boy, and it just shows you. He opened up the back cover and turned it around for me to see, and on the last flyleaf was printed the word schedule, and the date, September 12th, 1906, and underneath, rise from bed, ... 6 a.m., dumbbell exercise and wall scaling, ... 6:15 to 6:30. Study electricity, etc., more dots, 7:15 to 8:15. Work, more dots, a lot of dots, 8:30 to 4:30 p.m. Baseball and sports, more dots, 4:30 to 5 o'clock. Practice elocution, poise, and how to attain it, 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Study needed inventions, more dots, 7 to 9. General resolves. No wasting time at Schaefer's for a name indecipherable. No more smoking or chewing bath or any other day read one improving book or magazine per week. Save $5, crossed out $3 per week. Be better to parents. I come across this book by accident, said the old man. It just shows you, doesn't it? Yeah, it just shows you. Jimmy was bound to get ahead. Oh, he always had some resolves like this or something. Do you notice what he's got about improving his mind? He was always great for that. Oh, he told me a hog once, and I looked like a hog, and I beat him for it. Oh, he was reluctant to close the book, reading each item aloud and then looking eagerly at me, and I think he rather expected me to copy down the list for my own use. A little before 3, the Lutheran minister arrived from Flushing, and I began to look involuntarily out the windows for other cars. So did Gatsby's father. And as the time passed and the servants came in and stood by the waiting hall, his eyes began to blink anxiously, and then he spoke of the rain in a worried, uncertain way. The minister glanced several times at his watch, so I took him aside and asked him to wait for about half an hour, but it was any use. Nobody came. About 5 o'clock, our procession of 3 cars reached the cemetery and stopped in a thick drizzle beside the gate. First, a motor hearse, horribly black and wet. Then Mr. Gatz and his minister and I in a limousine, and a little hour, 4 or 5 servants and the postman from West Egg and Gatsby's station wagon, all wet to the skin. As we started through the gate into the cemetery, I heard a car stop and then the sound of someone splashing after us over the soggy ground. I looked around, and it was the man with the owl-eyed glasses who I found marveling over Gatsby's books in the library one night 3 months before. I had never seen him since then, and I don't know how he knew about the funeral or even his name. The rain poured down his thick glasses, and then he took them off and wiped them to see the protecting canvas unrolled from Gatsby's grave. Burp, I tried to think about Gatsby then for a moment, but he was already too far away, and I could only remember without resentment that Daisy hadn't sent a message or a flower. Dimly, I heard someone murmur, "Blessed are the dead that the rain falls on," and then the owl-eyed man said, "Amen to that," in a brave voice. We straggled down quickly through the rain and the cars, and Owl-Eye spoke to me by the gate. I couldn't get to the house," he remarked. "Well, neither could anybody else." "Go on," he started. "Why, my God, they used to go there by the hundreds." Took off his glasses and wiped them again, outside and in. You poor son of a bitch, he said. One of the most vivid memories is of coming back from West, from prep school and later from college at Christmas time. Those who went farther than Chicago would gather in the old dim Union Station at 6 o'clock on a December evening with a few Chicago friends already caught up in their old holiday gaieties to bid them a hasty goodbye. And I remember the fur coats of the girls running from Miss This or That's, and the chatter of frozen breath, and the hands waving overhead as we caught sight of all the old acquaintances, and the matchings of invitations. Hey, you gone to the Ordways? The Herseys? Or the Schultzes? And the long green tickets clasped tight in our gloved hands, and last the murky yellow cars of old Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul Railroad looking cheerful as Christmas itself on the tracks beside the gate. When we pulled out into the winter night of the real snow, our snow began to stretch out beside us and twinkle against the windows, and the dim lights of small Wisconsin stations moved by. A sharp, wild brace came suddenly into the air. We drew in deep breaths in it, and as we walked back from dinner through the old vestibules, unutterably aware of our identity with this country for one strange hour. Before we melted indistinguishably into it again, that's my Middle West. Not the wheat or the prairies or the lost Swede towns, but the thrilling returning trains of my youth, and the street lamps, and the sleigh bells, and the frosty dark, and the shadows, and the holly wreaths thrown by lighted windows on the snow. Oh, I'm part of that. A little solemn with the feel of those long winters, a little complacent from growing up in the Caraway house in a city where dwellings are still called through the decades by the family name. And I see now that this has been a story of the West after all. Tom and Gatsby, Daisy and Jordan and I, we're all Westerners, and perhaps we possess some deficiency in common which made us subtly unable to accept Eastern life. Oh, even when the East excited me most, even when I was most keenly aware of its superiority to the bored, sprawling, swollen towns beyond Ohio, with their interminable inquisitions, which spared only the children and the very old. Even then, it had always, for me, a quality of distortion. West Egg, especially, still figures in my more fantastic dreams, and I see it as a night scene by El Greco, 100 houses, one conventional and grotesque. Crouching under a sullen overhanging sky and lusterless moon, on the foreground 4 solemn men in dress suits are walking along the sidewalk with the stretcher in which lies a drunken woman in a white evening dress. Her hand, which dangles over the side, sparkles cold with jewels. Gravely the men turn in a house, the wrong house, but no one knows the woman's name and no one cares. After Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me like that. Distorted beyond my eyes, power of correction, so that when the blue smoke of brittle leaves was in the air, the little wind blew in wet laundry stiff on the line, I decided to come back home. Well, there's one thing to be done before I left, an awkward, unpleasant thing that perhaps had better be been let alone. But I wanted to leave things in order and not just trust the obliging and indifferent sea to sweep my refuse away. I saw Jordan Baker. Had talked over and around what had happened to us together, and what had happened afterward to me, and she lay perfectly still, listening in a big chair. Yeah, she was dressed to play golf, and I remember thinking that she looked like a good illustration, her chin raised a little jauntily, her hair the color of an autumn leaf, her face the same brown tint as the fingerless glove on her knee. And when I had finished, she told me without comment that she was engaged to another man. I doubted that, though there were several that she could have married in a nod of her head, but I pretended to be surprised. For just a minute, I wondered if I wasn't making a mistake. Then I thought it all over again quickly and got up to say goodbye. Nevertheless, you did throw me over, said Jordan suddenly. You threw me over on the telephone, and I don't give a damn about you now. But it was a new experience for me, and I felt a little dizzy for a while. We shook hands. Oh, and you do remember, she added, a conversation we once had about driving a car? Not exactly. You said a bad driver was only safe until she met another bad driver. Well, I met another bad driver, didn't I? I mean, it was careless of me to make such a wrong guess. I thought you were rather an honest, straightforward person. I thought it was your secret pride. I'm 30, I said. I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it an honor. Well, she didn't answer. Angry and half in love with her, and tremulously sorry, I turned away. One afternoon, late October, I saw Tom Buchanan. He was walking ahead of me along Fifth Avenue in his alert, aggressive way, his hands out a little bit from his body as if he would fight off interference, and his head moving sharply here and there, adapting itself to its restless eyes. And just as I slowed up to avoid overtaking him, he stopped and began frowning into the windows of a jewelry store. Suddenly saw me and walked back, holding out his hand. What's the matter, Nick? Do you object to shaking hands with me? Yes. You know what I think of you. Oh, you crazy, Nick, he said quickly. Crazy as hell. I don't know what's the matter with you. Tom, I inquired, what did you say to Wilson that afternoon? He stared at me without a word, and I knew I had guessed right about those missing hours. I started to turn away, but he took a step after me and grabbed my arm. I told him the truth, he said. He came to the door while we were getting ready to leave, and when I sent down word that we weren't in, he tried to force his way upstairs. He was crazy enough to kill me if I hadn't told him who owned the car. His hand was on a revolver in his pocket every minute he was in the house. He broke off finally. What if I did tell him? That fellow had it coming to him. Oh, he threw dust into your eyes just like he did Daisy's. But he was a tough one, eh? He ran over Myrtle like you'd run over a dog and never even stopped his car. Well, there's nothing I could say, except the one unutterable fact that it wasn't true. And if you think that I didn't have my share of suffering, look here. And when I went to give up that flat and saw the damn box of dog biscuits sitting there on the sideboard, I sat down and cried like a baby. By God, it was awful. I couldn't forgive him or like him, but I saw what he had done to him was entirely justified. It was all very careless and confused, and they were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things like creatures, and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness for whatever it was that kept them together, and let other people clean up the mess that they had made. I shook hands with him. It seemed silly not to, for I suddenly, as though I were talking to a child. And then he went to the jewelry store to buy a pearl necklace, or perhaps only a pair of cuff buttons, rid of my provincial squeamishness forever. Gatsby's house was still empty when I left. The grass on his lawn had grown as long as mine. One of the taxi drivers in the village never took a fare past the entrance gate without stopping for a minute and pointing inside. Perhaps it was he drove Daisy and Gatsby over East Egg that night of the accident, and perhaps he had made a story about all of it on his own. I didn't want to hear it, and I avoided him when I got off the train. I spent my Saturday nights in New York because those gleaming, dazzling parties of his were with me so vividly that I could still hear the music and the laughter, faint and incessant from his garden, and the cars going up and down his drive. One night I did hear a material car, and I saw its lights stop at his front steps, but I didn't investigate. Probably it was some final guest who had been away at the ends of the earth and didn't know what the party was over. And on the last night, with my trunk packed and my car sold to the grocer, I went over and sold his car to the grocer and looked at the huge incoherent failure of a house once more. On the white steps, an obscene word, scrawled by some boy with a piece of brick, stood out clearly in the moonlight, and I erased it. Drawing my shoe raspingly along the stone, and then I wandered down to the beach and sprawled out on the sand. Most of the big short places were closed now, and there were hardly any lights except for the shadowy moving glow of a ferry boat across the sound, and as the moon rose higher and essential houses began to melt away until gradually I became aware of the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh, green breast of the new world. Oh, its vanished trees, The trees that had made its way for Gatsby's house had once pandered in whispers to the last grace of all human dreams. For a transitory enchanted moment, a man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commiserate to his capacity of wonder. Oh, and as I sat there, brooding on his old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock. He had come a long way to his blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed, so close that he could hardly fail to grasp at it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Gatsby believed in the green light that the orgastic future that year by the year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms farther, and one fine morning, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. Well, that's the end of that story. Why don't we go down to the smoking room, where I can talk for a really long time about what I think about this book. There you are. Came down here to my smoking room, perhaps to have a cigarette or a pipe tobacco experience. You're still wearing the sun hat. I guess it's nice. It's like I'm sitting here smoking cigarettes with my grandma. That's nice. Let's recap what the hell we just read. 2 months after the previous chapter, Nick's talking about how newspapers are covering Gatsby's death. There was an inquest, and Mrs. Wilson's sister said that she had never cheated. Tom and Daisy disappeared. When Nick's at Gatsby's place, there's a phone call that he answers, and he learns about some kind of bond scheme. And the guy hangs up when Nick just says that he's just good old Nick. Gatsby's dad, Henry, shows up after hearing about his son's death, and Nick thinks that he cares more about Gatsby's accomplishments than his actual being dead. Nick calls out some of the party people, try and get them to come back for his funeral, but no one seems interested. Mr. Bert Klipspringer, the piano player, is more interested in getting his shoes back, and Mr. Wolfsheim just kind of says, I just want to celebrate people while they're alive. It rains the day of the funeral, and the only people there are Henry, Nick, the funeral director, some of the servants, the drunk guy from the library in Chapter 3, who says the obvious stuff about how, nobody showed up. Isn't that weird? Nick decides to go back to the Midwest, and he thinks that the East is superior in many ways, but the truths are distorted. He talks to Jordan, and she listens to him talk about why he doesn't want to see her anymore, and she's kind of got no reaction. She says, I'm engaged. And then she recalls in Chapter 3 a conversation about how she loved how honest he was, and accuses him of actually not being honest and letting her down. Kind of like how he talks bad about Gatsby, but actually he's obsessed with them, so he's just a hypocrite. He says, I'm 30. I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it an honor. Then he runs into Tom Buchanan. He wants to know what happened after Gatsby's death, specifically when Wilson came looking for Gatsby's car. He says that Wilson was crazy with grief and he had a gun. He says that even if he did tell him where Gatsby had lived, he got what he deserved. Quote, he threw dust into your eyes just like he did in Daisy's, but he ran over Myrtle like you'd run over a dog and never even stop his car. So he's a dick. Nick comments that he couldn't say much besides the one unutterable thing that it just wasn't true. He says that he can see Tom think he's completely justified in everything he's done. He can also see the truth in him and Daisy. On his last night, he goes over to Gatsby's place and just kind of stands on the dock, staring at the green light that used to be Daisy's dock, and just kind of reflects on what happened. What's good? Turns out Nick might be gay. So this is a thing I had to do a little research on. My daughter told me when she found out that I was reading this thing, she said, I've never read it, but I heard that the main character's gay. And I said, you always watch TV or read books and you want to turn every character gay all the time. You do it constantly. They said, no, this time the Nick is actually supposed to be gay. So she sent me some stuff and I did some of my own research, and I found out that in Chapter 2, there's a part that nearly everyone seems to skip, including myself, where Nick accompanies Tom Buchanan and his mistress Myrtle to the apartment that Tom keeps in Manhattan. Myrtle invites her sister and some neighbors, and Mr. and Mrs. McKee, to join them. They throw a raucous party that ends with Tom breaking Myrtle's nose, and amid the blood and the screaming, Mr. McKee awakens from an alcoholic slumber. I remember that part. And then this part happens. Then Mr. McKee turned and continued out the door. Taking my hat from the chandelier, I followed. Come to lunch someday, he suggested as we groaned down the elevator. Where? Anywhere. Keep your hands off the lever, snapped the elevator boy. I beg your pardon, said Mr. McKee with dignity. I didn't know I was touching it. All right, I agreed. I'll be glad to. Then it just says ... I was standing beside his bed, and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, with a great portfolio in his hands. Beauty and the Beast, Loneliness, Old Grocery Horse, Brook and Bridge. Then I was lying half asleep in the cold lower level of the Pennsylvania station, staring at the Morning Tribune and waiting for the 4 o'clock train. So that little scene where he's standing beside his bed and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear, that's the part that everyone points out. It turns out, besides that, there's another scene where there's this confusing part where he's on a train and he's going back home in Chapter 7. And then the conductor walks by, checking everyone's tickets, and the conductor says, "Hot," said the conductor to familiar faces. "Some weather. Hot, hot, hot. It's hot enough for you? Is it hot? Is it?" My communication ticket came back to me with a dark stain from his hand. That anyone should care in this heat whose flushed lips he kissed, whose head made damp the pajama pocket over his heart. So that's kind of vague, too. That's more vague than the previous one. These scenes were first pointed out by Keith Frazier in 1979 essay Another Reading of the Great Gatsby. Also in 1992, Edward Woysoik argued in The Sexual Drama of Nick and Gatsby that the gay subtext in Gatsby is crystal clear. I do not know how one can read the scene in McKee's bedroom any other way, especially when there are so many facts about Nick's behavior to support such a conclusion. The scene in Chapter 2 with McKee is kind of a Rosetta Stone, where you can find more into Nick's motivations from there. So, a little confusing, but that one scene with the bedroom you can't get rid of. Some people have speculated that it's just hot in New York in the 1920s, that people will say, "Why don't you come to my house?" Weirdly convinced that somehow it's cooler inside an apartment than it is being anywhere else, and then just hangs out in their underwear. That's something someone said, but that's probably not true. His relationship with Jordan Baker is a little weird because if you look at it, Jordan Baker's kind of masculine in the story, at least as far as the way that Nick describes her. He says that Jordan Baker, who is an athlete who carries herself like a young cadet, is most alluring to Nick when they play tennis and has a, quote, faint mustache of perspiration that appears on her upper lip. When she and Nick break up at the end of the book, Jordan tells him that she had thought that he was an honest, straightforward person, to which he responds, "I'm 30, I'm 5 years too old to lie to myself and call it an honor." A line that rings differently if you read it as him being possibly a closeted gay man. He also never does more with her than just kiss. It's not like sex is a bad thing in this book. People are having it left and right. It's something that the crowd that he hangs out with would frown upon because they all hang out while Tom is cheating on Daisy. So if he was making it with Jordan Baker, it wouldn't be a problem. So he doesn't have those kind of ethics going on. He's around these loose 1920s flappers. Gatsby. There's also some opinion about Nick's attachment to Gatsby, being that he's in love with him, and that it's a sad point of the story is that Gatsby doesn't return the same feeling. People have made parallels between Nick using Jordan as a distraction from how he really feels, and Gatsby doing something similar with Daisy, focusing on a time when he didn't have to deal with complicated sexual feelings and wanted to return back to a time when he was interested in Daisy and get that back again. The last comparison it kind of feels like a stretch for me, especially since in my wrap-up a little bit, I say how I don't think this author is really capable of that kind of subtle complexity. But you can't ignore that the scene in Chapter 2 and the confusing scene on the train in Chapter 7, so there's a really good chance that Fitzgerald was slipping in something to let the reader know that Nick might be gay, or at least bisexual. I think if Nick were actually coming to a realization that he was gay and didn't want to lie to himself and call it an honor, the idea of going back to the Midwest in the 1920s is probably the worst goddamn idea you could ever have. There's no way you're going to live some kind of honest life in the Midwest in the 1920s without being persecuted. What sucks? Just everyone. What did we learn? Catherine lying about Myrtle's affair is just another example of the self-preservation and selfishness of what Nick has experienced on the East Coast, making Nick even more bitter towards the people he keeps obsessing over. Nick, on some level, doesn't like what he had become while tagging along with this group, so he tries to pretend that he never approved of them from the first place and spends this chapter finding more reasons to back it up, like the disappearance of Tom and Daisy, who were probably planning it back in the kitchen that one night, Gatsby's dad being a turd and only caring about his dead son's achievements. Only 2 party guests come around to the funeral. Klipspringer's attitude about his tennis shoes, his conversation with Jordan, who comes off even more deluded than before, and his conversation with Tom, who's creating kind of his own reality around basically getting Gatsby killed. Like Nick's attitude towards Gatsby in the last chapter, he continues to hold himself on a higher moral ground while ignoring his own actions. This time, he gets all fussed that everyone is smug and selfish and dishonest. He withholds telling Tom, who really was driving Gatsby's car and who really killed Myrtle, which is a lie in itself. He likes that he knows the real truth. It seems to like it that Tom doesn't know what kind of a monster he's married to. Nick makes parallels to the East Coast wealthy society's path towards prosperity and the quote-unquote American dream and his passive attempt to fit into it, being a lot like Gatsby's deluded path towards his own dream of being with Daisy, which is shown as empty as he stands pointlessly on Gatsby's dock, remembering that time that the spot was once important with the green light. The parallels between Nick and Gatsby is played out here. Nick is alive while Gatsby's dead. Nick feels that he can return to his past of a life with integrity, while Gatsby tried to return to his to be an honest life with Daisy and failed. And then there's the line about the Republic, just kind of guessing in general. That's like the American dream theme going on through this book, that maybe that's like going back to the Republic, the word used when the founding fathers, I don't know, I lost interest. In the end, Nick is a jerk. He came to the East Coast all smug, like he was better than everyone, and already held them up to be fake and selfish. He was more than willing to get involved with them and get swept up in their lifestyle, even as he had never really included his member, but it didn't really bother him. He just loved being around it. And only when he realized that the life that they had wasn't sustainable did he begin to be more hostile towards them, but never outwardly. Just in his head, because if he let any of them know that he was angry at them or thought that they were dorks, they wouldn't have accepted them into a group fully. And if they did, he would have jumped on it, so he's always kind of holding out a little bit of hope that that's going to happen. So he doesn't look at his own actions or acknowledge his want to be a part of this group, and instead starts judging Gatsby, even as he tries to spend all his time with them. And he helps at the funeral, but resents everyone he has to interact with. And when he actually has a chance to speak the truth to power by telling Tom his wife is actually a murderer, he doesn't, either because he likes having the upper hand, or he doesn't want to offend someone he admires. Either way, it's dishonest and goes against his own self-proclaimed code. His romanticizing of the Midwest is stupid. There's just as much dishonesty and selfishness on the East Coast, along with people who look out for each other and themselves that are narcissistic like Daisy. But he decides that the quality of people there are different, which is the same kind of generalizations Tom was doing when he was being racist in earlier chapters. Nick sucks. And I think that the author was such a horrible person in his own life, he didn't intend Nick to just be another horrible person in a book full of horrible people. I think that he actually thought Nick was like the cool guy. And I think the author probably didn't see that nearly the one-for-one attitude of people in the Midwest versus the East Coast as being the same mentality as Tom's opinions about race in earlier chapters. This is a guy who stole most of his wife's work, and he probably didn't have the kind of depth or skill needed to pull off any of that kind of complexity. Oh, thank God. Well, with that, you can finally frickin' go home, and I will probably just wind up seeing you next week. Well, it appears you found me in the part of the podcast I hate the most, where I tell you all about the places on the internet where you can find me. You can tell I hate this because of the sound effects making it sound like a stormy night in the drawing room of the damned. Now, there's that. Are you cool? I like cool people. It's the reason why I got involved in this business to begin with, just to meet cool people, not losers. So if you're cool, feel free to go over to my website, nuzzlehouse.com, which basically just points you to Mastodon. Why did I go all in with Mastodon? I have no idea. But if you go there, it'll point you to my link tree where you can listen to episodes, which is confusing and meticulous. But if you want to go to just my link tree, which is linktr.ee Nuzzlehouse, it'll point you to all the rest of my shows, like Glenn Reads Books to You, which you're listening to right now, Gestating the Curious Mind, where my wife and I write paranormal smut and then publish it on Amazon. And also Nuzzlehouse's CBS Radio Mystery Theater, where we basically create our own episodes of Radio Mystery Theater, a show from the 70s, because they don't make them anymore. Damn it, we want to hear something new. Oh, I'm also on Instagram, something that I try to use but dislike, which is Instagram.com/HouseNuzzle. And the lesser now, thanks to Elon Musk, Twitter. Used to be my home, and now I can't stand it, which is Twitter.com/HouseNuzzle. And since I think you might be cool, you can always just email me directly, glenn.nuzzles@gmail.com. But don't email if you're a nerdling or a dork. Now, back to business. Can't believe I drank all of them already. There's gotta be one left.